All right, so you guys asked us to take a deep dive into this, and we're going to do it light sport aircraft.
Okay.
And we've got a stack of info, like always. This time it's from the FAA's Airplane Flying Handbook.
Okay.
And we're going to go through this and kind of figure out what's going on.
All right. Sounds good.
You might think, when you hear the word light sport aircraft, that you're going to be thinking about simple things.
Right.
And it is partly true.
Right.
But get ready for some curveballs here. Some interesting stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it is an interesting part of aviation. It opens it up to a wider range of people.
Okay.
And that's because of how the FAA defines them.
Yeah.
It has to be a single reciprocating engine, a fixed landing gear, except of course for seaplanes and gliders, and a fixed or ground adjustable prop.
Okay.
It has maximum takeoff weight limits, 1,320 pounds for land, 1,430 for a seaplane,
Okay.
a max of 2 occupants, non-pressurized cabin, a maximum speed in level flight of 120 knots, and a maximum stall speed of 45 knots.
Okay, so it's almost like they took the idea of a sporty airplane
Right.
and made an official, definition of it.
Right. And then there's the interesting part about their designations.
Okay.
You have your standard LSAs,
Okay.
which are aircraft that were already around that fit the definition. But then you have your SLSAs and your ELSAs,
Okay.
which are specifically built for this market. And those aren't type certified by the FAA in the same way.
Oh, okay. So are they just flying around willy-nilly with no
No,
safety
no.
check?
So instead of that full FAA certification process, which can be very lengthy and very expensive, these SLSAs and ELSAs, they're built to what are called ASTM industry consensus standards.
Okay.
And so this is a different set of guidelines. It's less restrictive, and it allows for more innovation, and it helps keep the cost down too.
Okay. Interesting. So that makes them more affordable.
Right.
So it kind of makes sense, right?
Right.
So if I wanted to go fly an LSA, what kind of license would I need?
So there is a dedicated certificate for LSA pilots, and it's called the Sport Pilot Certificate.
Sport pilot. Oops.
But here's the cool thing. If you have a higher certification, like a private pilot license or a commercial or an ATP or recreational pilot license, you can also fly LSAs.
Okay.
The only thing you need is a valid U.S. driver's license as proof of medical eligibility.
Wait a second. You're telling me I could go fly an airplane with just a driver's license?
Well, there is a caveat to that.
Okay.
If your medical certificate was ever denied, revoked, or suspended, you can't use the driver's license.
Okay.
You would need a valid FAA medical certificate to fly the LSA.
Okay. That's a really important detail for anyone out there who's thinking about making this switch. So let's say I'm ready to make this jump to LSAs.
Okay.
What are my first steps?
The handbook really emphasizes taking a structured approach to the transition,
Okay.
just like you would any other aircraft transition. Picking the right flight school is very critical. You really want one with proven experience with LSAs.
So not every flight school out there will do. What are
Yeah.
some questions? Like if I'm going to these flight schools,
Right.
I don't want to, give them the third degree.
Well, you should be thorough and ask them how many LSA transitions they've done, what their rental policies are, what their insurance policies are, how they handle maintenance, their record-keeping, scheduling, all that stuff.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm taking notes.
Yeah.
So we got our flight school squared away. Now we need to find, that perfect instructor. Right.
Yeah.
What am I looking for there? Someone who's just super enthusiastic about LSAs.
Well, you want them to have solid experience in light sport aircraft.
Okay.
And there are 2 types of flight instructor certificates that are relevant to this.
Yeah.
You have your Flight Instructor S, who focuses solely on LSAs.
Right.
And you have your Flight Instructor A, who can teach LSAs and other aircraft.
So should I just always look for the S-rated instructor?
Yeah. Well, while an A can certainly teach you, someone who's dedicated their career to LSAs might have that edge in experience and knowledge
Right.
with that particular aircraft.
Okay, so I found the right instructor. I've got my flight school picked out. I'm ready to start my training. What can I expect? What are some of the things that are unique about learning to fly an LSA?
Well, a good transition program is going to cover a wide range of topics. And one that kind of stood out to me in the handbook was the emphasis on weather considerations.
Okay, why is the weather such a big deal for these things? I mean, it's weather, for an airplane.
Right. It has to do with the fact that it's so lightweight.
Okay.
If you think about it, like a small sailboat is going to get tossed around by the waves a lot more than a huge cargo ship.
Okay. Hold on.
And so it's the same principle here. Mastering things like wake turbulence avoidance and really being aware of the wind and its impact on your LSA are very, very important.
That's a great analogy. What are some other training highlights?
So there's also a lot of focus on soft field and short field takeoffs and landings and
Really?
spin awareness.
Oh.
LSAs can be more prone to spins than some other aircraft, and so that training is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so they're simple,
Right.
but they still require all these special skills and knowledge to be safe.
Exactly.
So that's really interesting. And that brings us to another thing, maintenance. Just like any aircraft, LSAs need that meticulous care, right?
Right.
But there's a little more flexibility when it comes to who can do the work.
Yeah, with SLSAs, there are 4 groups that are authorized to maintain and inspect them.
Okay.
You have your LSA repairman with a maintenance rating, which makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
You have an FAA certified airframe and power plant mechanic,
Mm.
someone specified by the aircraft manufacturer. And then here's the one that's a little bit unique. You have owners themselves for certain limited tasks.
Oh, wow.
Right.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
But I bet you can't just go out there and start tinkering around.
Right. No, the aircraft maintenance manual is still your Bible. Yeah. And you have to consult it for specifics on what you're allowed to do and how you're allowed to do it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, I noticed the handbook said the FAA doesn't issue airworthiness directives, or ADs, for SLSAs and ELSAs.
Okay.
Does that mean I'm off the hook for those?
Not entirely. If you have an FAA certified component installed, like a certain engine cookies for that component still apply.
Okay, so it's not a total free pass.
Right.
All right. Well, that's pretty cool, though. Speaking of cool, let's talk about the design of LSAs. What makes them so unique?
One of the things that stands out is the variety of materials used.
Oh.
You'll see everything from wood and fabric to metal to composites or even combinations. And this design flexibility helps keep them lightweight and kind of contributes to their overall feel.
Okay, so let's say I'm doing my pre-flight. I walk around and I look at this plane and I'm thinking, okay, what am I looking for?
Right.
Like, how's it different depending on how it's made?
If you see an LSA that's steel tube and fabric construction,
Okay.
the fabric itself really needs a thorough inspection. Make sure there are no tears or excessive fading or anything that suggests it's not in top shape.
Okay, so it's just like any other fabric airplane.
Yeah.
What about aluminum, since that's probably the most common?
Aluminum, you're looking for corrosion, loose rivets, dents, cracks, anything like that.
Yeah, okay. And what about those like sleek-looking composite ones?
Those are cool. You have to be more on the lookout for hairline cracks and delamination. That's where the layers of the composite start to separate.
Okay. And how about engines? Are they pretty standard across LSAs?
Not quite. You'll see a mix of FAA certified and non-certified engines.
Okay.
But a lot of LSAs use water-cooled 4-cycle carbureted engines,
Okay.
which is different from the air-cooled designs that you might be more accustomed to.
So what's that mean when I'm flying? What's the difference?
These engines, they run at much higher RPMs, and they use a gearbox to reduce the propeller speed, so the sound and feel of the airplane in flight can be very different.
Okay, interesting. So it's not just what it looks like. It's the whole experience of flying it
Right.
is going to be different.
Right.
All right. And speaking of the experience, everyone's talking about glass cockpits these days.
Right.
Are those common in LSAs?
Yeah, actually, they're pretty common. LSAs are often equipped with electronic flight instrumentation systems, or EFIS for short.
Okay.
And this basically puts all of your flight info, attitude, airspeed, altitude, navigation, engine instruments,
Wow.
all on 1 or 2 screens.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But that's a lot of stuff on a screen. How do you keep it all straight?
That's why training on the specific EFIS in your aircraft is very critical.
Yeah.
You really have to learn how to interpret that data quickly and efficiently without becoming overwhelmed or losing your situational awareness.
So it's not replacing good stick and rudder skills. It's just augmenting them.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have for this part of our deep dive into light sport aircraft. All right, we've covered, gosh, it seems like we've covered so much.
Yeah.
But stay tuned for part 2, where we're going to delve even deeper into the LSA experience.
Sounds good.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into light sport aircraft. So we left off talking about all the things that make LSAs unique, from their regulations to their design.
Right.
But now I want to hear about what it's actually like to fly one.
Mm-hmm.
Like what sets them apart when you're up in the air?
Well, one of the first things you'll notice is how responsive they are. Because of that high power to weight ratio we were talking about, they accelerate really quickly and climb like a rocket.
Okay, so it sounds like I better hold on tight because it's going to be a thrilling ride.
You got it. They're designed to be nimble and fun to fly, but because of that responsiveness, you have to be, really smooth and precise with the controls. Over-controlling is a common mistake, especially for pilots who are transitioning from heavier aircraft.
Okay, so what happens if I do get a little, overzealous with the controls? The handbook mentions something called pilot-induced oscillations. What exactly does that mean?
Okay, so imagine you're trying to maintain a specific altitude, right?
Hmm.
You make a correction, but you overdo it so the plane pitches up too much. Then you try to correct in the other direction and you overdo it again and the nose goes down. And you end up in this cycle of chasing the altitude, creating these oscillations. It's like a seesaw effect.
I think I get it. It's like when I was trying to learn to ride a unicycle.
Yeah.
I was oscillating all over the place.
That's a perfect analogy. It's all about finding that balance and using smooth, gentle control inputs.
Okay, so no more unicycling in the sky for me.
Yeah.
Speaking of finding that balance, the handbook also talked a lot about trimming. Why is that so important, especially in an LSA?
Trimming helps reduce the workload on the pilot. It relieves those control pressures and actually allows you to fly hands off, which can be really important, especially in turbulence or during maneuvers. And since LSAs are lighter, they tend to be more susceptible to bumps and gusts. So proper trimming it's really key to having a smooth and comfortable flight.
All right, so trim for a nice, smooth ride. Got it. Now, I'm curious about how LSAs perform in different flight conditions, like let's say I'm in slow flight. How do they handle?
Because of their design, LSAs excel in slow flight. They're actually very stable at lower airspeeds, speeds that would be, pretty close to a stall warning in a heavier aircraft.
Okay, so they're a bit more forgiving in that sense. I'm always a fan of a more forgiving airplane.
Well, yes, but it's still important to maintain positive control and know those stall warning signs. Don't get too comfortable.
Of course, I'm not planning on pushing any boundaries up there. So how about stall recovery? Is it any different in an LSA?
The principles of stall recovery are basically the same. You want to reduce the angle of attack, lower the nose, and smoothly apply power. But with LSAs, those control forces are a lot lighter. So it's even more important to be gentle and avoid any abrupt control inputs.
Okay, so smooth and steady wins the race when it comes to stalls.
Gotcha.
What about spins? The handbook mentioned that LSAs might be a bit more prone to them. Should I be worried about that?
It's something to be aware of, definitely. They're lighter weight and some specific design characteristics, can make them a little bit more susceptible to entering a spin, especially if a pilot isn't careful with those control inputs. That's why spin awareness training is so crucial for anyone transitioning to an LSA.
Okay, so knowledge is power. I'll be sure to pay close attention during that part of my training. Now, I want to circle back to crosswind landings. We touched on it earlier, but I'm still curious about why they can be such a challenge, especially in LSAs.
Remember that we talked about LSEs being lighter? Well, a strong, gusty crosswind can have a much bigger impact on a light aircraft, potentially pushing you off course as you're trying to land.
It sounds like landing in an LSA in a strong crosswind is a bit like trying to, I don't know, land a feather on a windy day.
That's a great way to put it. You really have to master those crosswind landing techniques. It's a combination of using the ailerons and the rudder to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway while also crabbing into the wind to compensate for the drift.
Okay, so it's a delicate dance with those controls. Now, what about that final moment, that touchdown? Is flaring any different in an LSA?
Because LSAs have what's called a lower wing loading, they tend to float a little bit more during the flare, which can make that touchdown a bit more, well, gentle. It's something you'll get the hang of with practice.
All right, I'm making a mental note to practice those crosswind landings and flares. It's fascinating how all these little details add up to a unique flying experience in an LSA.
Absolutely. And speaking of unique, let's talk a little bit more about those glass cockpits, the EFIS systems.
Okay, you mentioned that they're pretty common in LSAs. What are the pros and cons of having all that information right there on those screens?
EFIS is a great tool, no doubt about it. It puts all that essential flight information on a single display, which makes it easier to scan and interpret everything quickly. And it tends to be more reliable than traditional instruments, and it requires less maintenance.
So less time fiddling with gauges and more time enjoying the view.
Exactly. And a lot of these modern EFIS systems come with really cool features like moving maps, terrain awareness, and even traffic information, which really enhances safety and situational awareness.
Wow, it's like having a mini air traffic control center right there in the cockpit. So what's the downside? There's got to be a trade-off somewhere, right?
Well, I mean, they can be more expensive than those traditional instruments. And of course, you need specific training to use them properly. You have to be able to interpret all that data without getting distracted or overwhelmed. It's a powerful tool, but it doesn't replace good piloting skills and judgment.
Right. Okay, so a little extra learning curve, but it seems like those safety benefits really outweigh the costs. Now, let's talk about those ballistic parachute systems. How effective are they? I'm having a hard time picturing pulling a ripcord and having a huge parachute deploy over my airplane.
They are a pretty amazing safety innovation. Essentially, it's a last resort option, for those really rare situations where making a safe landing just isn't possible. Think about things like a catastrophic structural failure or a complete loss of control. Those situations where a traditional emergency landing might not be survivable.
So it's like an ejection seat, but for the whole airplane.
You got it. It's a whole aircraft parachute system. And when it's deployed, it really slows down that descent rate drastically so the plane lands much more softly, which can hopefully minimize injuries or damage.
I can see why they're becoming more and more popular on LSAs. But this isn't something you just deploy willy-nilly,
Right.
right?
Absolutely not. It's a decision that should only be made in extreme circumstances where there are no other options. The pilot has to carefully assess the situation and weigh the risks and benefits before activating that parachute system.
Okay, so it's a last resort, a life-saving tool, but not a get-out-of-jail-free card for every tricky situation. Now let's talk about LSA engines. We've mentioned the water-cooled ones a couple of times. How do those differ from the air-cooled engines you find in a lot of other airplanes?
Water-cooled engines are known for being really efficient. They have a higher power-to-weight ratio, and they run a lot smoother and quieter, which can make for a more pleasant experience for everyone on board.
It's like comparing a modern car engine to one from, I don't know, 50 years ago.
That's a good analogy. They're more technologically advanced and offer some great benefits, but they do have more components. A water-cooled engine needs a whole cooling system, with a radiator and hoses and all that, which can add some complexity.
And more complexity probably means more things that can potentially go wrong, right? Are they harder to maintain compared to air-cooled engines?
It really depends on the specific engine and how it's designed. But, those routine maintenance tasks are pretty similar. You just have to add those regular checks of the cooling system to make sure there are no leaks or anything like that.
Okay, so a few extra things to keep an eye on, but nothing too drastic. Now, how about fuel systems? Anything unusual or unique about those in LSAs?
You'll find quite a bit of variation in fuel systems in LSAs, actually. Some are simple gravity-fed systems, others have fuel pumps and tank selectors. It's really important to familiarize yourself with the specific fuel system in your aircraft.
And of course, fuel management is crucial no matter what kind of airplane you're flying.
Absolutely. You always want to double check those fuel levels before and during the flight and be aware of your airplane's fuel consumption. LSAs are known to be pretty efficient, but you still need to plan those flights carefully and make sure you have enough fuel to get to your destination with reserves.
No one wants to be that pilot who ends up as a cautionary tale because they ran out of gas.
Yeah.
Now, shifting gears a bit, what about the human factor when it comes to flying LSAs? Are there any common challenges or mistakes that pilots make when they're transitioning to these aircraft?
One of the biggest ones, like we talked about earlier, is over-controlling. Because LSAs are so responsive, it's easy to get a little overzealous with those control inputs,
Right.
and you end up fighting the airplane instead of working with it. Remember, smooth and gentle is the key.
Okay, so I need to channel my inner Zen master when I'm flying an LSA.
Exactly. It takes practice to develop that feel, that finesse. Another challenge is situational awareness, especially when you're flying in busy airspace or dealing with challenging weather conditions.
Why is situational awareness even more important in an LSA compared to other types of aircraft?
LSAs are smaller and, they can be harder to see, especially for other pilots. So you need to be extra vigilant about scanning for traffic and avoiding potential conflicts. And because they're lighter, they're more affected by weather. So you have to stay ahead of the game, make smart decisions based on what's happening around you.
Okay, so it sounds like it's all about being proactive, thinking ahead, and staying aware of everything that's going on.
You got it. It's all about respecting the aircraft, understanding its limitations, and never getting complacent.
Great advice. Now, as we start to wrap up this part of our LSA journey, what words of wisdom would you offer to someone who's listening to this and thinking, hey, maybe I want to give LSA flying a try?
I would say do your research and don't be afraid to take that leap. There are so many different kinds of LSAs out there, each with its own unique character. Talk to owners, talk to pilots, visit flight schools, and try to get some experience in a few different aircraft. The best way to know if it's for you is to try it. Find a qualified instructor and take a discovery flight. You might just find your new passion.
Well said.
Yeah.
It's inspiring to hear your enthusiasm and passion for LSAs.
I truly enjoy flying them. They offer a sense of freedom, a connection to the sky, a whole different perspective on the world.
I could definitely hear that in your voice. It's contagious. So on that note, we'll wrap up this part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot about what it's like to fly an LSA, from performance characteristics to the human side of things. But stay tuned for part 3, where we'll explore the impact LSAs have had on the world of aviation and what the future holds for this exciting category. Welcome back to the deep dive.
So we spent the last couple of parts really getting into the nitty-gritty of what makes light sport aircraft so special.
Right.
But now I want to zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. How have these LSAs, how have they changed the world of aviation?
Okay.
And what does the future hold for this whole category?
Well, that's a great question, and it really has kind of multifaceted answer. I think one of the biggest impacts LSAs have had is opening up the world of flying to, a much wider range of people. Right. You mentioned that earlier, and I want to dig into that a bit more. What is it about LSAs that make them so accessible compared to, your typical airplane?
Well, it's a combination of things, really. First of all, LSAs are just generally more affordable,
Okay.
both to buy and to operate. Now, I'm not saying they're cheap,
Right.
but they definitely lower that financial barrier to entry for someone who wants to become a pilot.
So it's not just a hobby for the super wealthy anymore.
No, not at all. LSAs have really kind of democratized aviation,
Okay.
and it's brought that dream of flight within reach for, a much broader spectrum of people. And it's not just about the cost of the airplane itself. The sport pilot license, with its reduced training requirements compared to a private pilot license, that also makes it more attainable for folks who maybe have busy lives or, limited resources.
Absolutely. So it's like this whole other entry point
Right.
into the world of aviation.
Exactly.
Now, what about flight training itself? Have LSAs changed the way people learn to fly?
I would say definitely. A lot of flight schools have really embraced LSAs. They use them both for primary training
Okay.
and for sport pilot instruction because they are relatively simple to operate, which allows the student to really focus on those core flying skills
Okay.
without getting bogged down by complex systems,
Yeah, absolutely. And plus, they're cheaper to operate, so it's probably better for the flight schools as well.
It is, yeah. It's a win-win.
Yeah, everybody wins.
So we've talked about, the economic impact. What about the environmental side of things? Are LSAs better for the environment compared to
Right.
traditional aircraft?
I would say generally, yes, they are.
Yeah.
Because LSAs are lighter, they have smaller engines, and they often have more aerodynamic designs. All of that translates to better fuel efficiency,
Okay.
which means lower operating cost and a reduced environmental footprint, which I know a lot of pilots are concerned about these days.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so easier on the wallet and easier on the planet. I like that.
Now, if we look ahead, what does the future hold for LSAs? Where do you think this whole category is headed?
Well, I think we're going to continue to see, a lot of innovation and growth in the LSA market.
Okay.
Manufacturers are constantly pushing the boundaries, developing new designs, incorporating new technologies. Think things like lightweight composites, even more efficient engines, and even electric propulsion systems are starting to emerge.
Whoa, electric LSAs.
Yeah,
That sounds pretty amazing.
it is, yeah. You can imagine flying silently over the countryside,
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Absolutely. Now, what about all this, autonomous flight technology that we're hearing so much about? Could that find its way into LSAs?
I think it's definitely a possibility. Autonomous flight has the potential to, revolutionize aviation.
Yeah.
And LSAs, with their, inherent simplicity and adaptability, could really be at the forefront of that transformation. Imagine a future where, LSAs are used for everything from personal transportation to, aerial surveys, package delivery, all without a pilot on board.
Wow, that's a wild future.
It is.
I kind of want to be around to see that.
Mhm.
But, let's bring it back down to earth a little bit.
Okay.
So someone's listening to this and they're thinking, man, I really want to try this LSA thing. What advice would you give them?
I would say do your research. Don't be afraid to take the plunge.
Okay.
There are so many different types of LSAs out there. Talk to other LSA owners, talk to pilots, visit some flight schools, and really try to experience different aircraft firsthand.
Okay.
The best way to know if it's right for you is to try it.
Right.
Find a qualified instructor and take a discovery flight. You
Yeah.
never know. You might just find your new passion.
That's great advice. And speaking of passion, it's really come through in our conversations how much you enjoy flying LSAs.
Hmm.
What is it about them that really speaks to you on that personal level?
For me, it's just that feeling of freedom, that connection to the sky, experiencing the world from a completely different perspective.
Right.
LSAs with their, simplicity and that pure joy of flight, they kind of bring me back to the roots
Mm-hmm.
of why I fell in love with aviation in the first place.
Yeah.
It's not about complex systems or high speeds.
Right.
It's about that connection between pilot and aircraft.
I can hear it in your voice. It's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights and your enthusiasm with us.
Yeah, of course.
It's been a real pleasure learning about this world of LSAs with you.
The pleasure was all mine.
All right. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive into light sport aircraft. We've really gone through a lot, from how they work to the impact they've had on aviation. We've learned about their unique design, how affordable they are, their environmental benefits, and really all those amazing possibilities for the future. But really, the biggest takeaway, I think, is just how much fun they are to fly.
They are, yeah.
So if you've ever had even a little inkling of a dream of taking to the sky, don't let it just sit there. Go out, do a little research, and see if LSAs might be the right path for you. And who knows, you might just discover a passion you never even knew you had. So thanks for joining us on the deep dive, and until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those wings level.